Yeah, I am a research professor at the Florida State University Coastal and Marine Lab. I'm also a scientific advisor for the Save Our Seas Foundation. Um, I used to be with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science for some time. That's where I did my PhD, and then I was faculty there for a couple of years before I moved back to Florida. So that's where my background in cownose rays comes from. But you can see that our symbol for the FSU Coastal Marine Lab has a cownose ray on it. So that's pretty cool. Um, this is where my lab is, right in the beginning of the armpit of Florida, you could say, right in the Big Bend area of Florida. And so most of the work I do now is divided between coastal shark ecology and ray ecology. We're tracking cownose rays in Florida now. Deep sea ecology, particularly deep sea work related to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And then a lot of work on small tooth sawfish as well, which was the first native marine fish listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So all the work that we do addresses questions needed for fisheries management and conservation. So we just generally concentrate on species that are either economically important, subject to overfishing, or they're threatened or endangered. And we do a lot of work with state, federal agencies, a lot of collaborations with NGOs as well. And most of the work we do is on sharks and rays. Um, and so the kind of work I do in my lab, we do population level work. What is the status of shark and ray populations over space and time? Are they overfished? If so, how can we help them to recover? Do a lot of life history work. How long does it take them to reach maturity? How many offspring do they have? Those kinds of things. We do lots of tagging and telemetry, using every tool in the tool chest to look at important habitats across the sharks and rays use across their lifetime. A lot of that work now is also related to climate change. We do a lot of work on community structure, asking questions on what drives species, communities, and interactions in the food webs, as well as a lot of physiology work, looking at stress physiology, reproductive physiology, post-release mortality, the effects of habitat degradation, those kinds of things. So today I'm going to talk about cownose rays, and I've got a lot I'm going to try to get to. And so I'll move through some of it pretty fast. We're going to more or less follow this outline. We're going to first talk about what is a cownose ray. Then we're going to talk about cownose ray populations in Chesapeake Bay specifically. And then I'm going to move on to a purported trophic cascade that had some unfortunate consequences for cownose rays. And so I call that trophic cascades and cownose ray scapegoats. And then we'll end talking about the effects of that scapegoating, which was the Save the Bay, Eat a Ray phenomenon. And then we'll end with some recommendations for management a little bit. So let's start with what is a cownose ray. So I'm not going to get into the weeds on biology, and evolution and taxonomy, even though I love taxonomy. I love taxonomy so much. But I won't go too crazy with that. This is basically a simple cladogram of chondrichthyine relationships. And so that's all the sharks and rays and chimeras. Within this group, the cownose rays are right here in this group of batoids. And then there are two super orders of sharks, and then there's these little chimeras up here. Um, so the cownose rays are batoids. And you ask, what is a batoid? Well, a batoid, one of the only differences that between a shark and a ray or a batoid is if you take the pectoral fins and fuse them to the head over the gills so that the gill slits are underneath, you're a batoid. If the pectoral fins are not fused to the head so the gill slits are on the side, you're a shark. That's the main difference. These two groups, this is a paper by former FSU student Neil Ashelman that shows divergence times of all the different batoids down here from each other and from their shark outgroup. And I'm just going to point out that it's about 200 million years ago, maybe a little more than that, we think now, that sharks and the rays diverged from each other. And within this group, if we look down in here, you'll see our cownose rays right in there, very closely related to the devil rays. And those two groups diverged from each other probably about 50 million years ago, the devil rays and the cownose rays. So they're very closely related to the devil rays like manta rays. So in short, this is a batoid. This is a shark, gills on the side. Other than the gill placement, another one of the main differences between the two groups is this is a CT scan Gavin Naylor sent me of a stingray. And if you see these vertebrae right here, the anterior most vertebrae that are closest to the skull and array are all fused together in what's called a synarcual. That gives them the ability, basically stiffens their skeleton to allow them to flap those pectoral fins for locomotion. If you look at a shark, they don't have that. So they don't have that synarcual, those fused vertebrae right there. That's pretty much the only real differences between a shark and a ray right there. Within the batoids, the Cownose rays are in this group of over 200 species called stingrays and mantas of myliobatiforms. Mylio means to mill or to grind, and so having grinding tooth plates is sort of a common feature among the myliobatiforms. In addition, most of the species in this group, and they're the only batoids that have venomous spines. And so these are basically modified scales, modified dermal denticles that have a skin on them with goblet cells that produce hemolytic toxins, and they slough off into the wounds. And I could tell you all kinds of stories about getting stuck by stingrays, either me or colleagues or other people, but we don't have time for that. So that's another common feature of this group of batoids is having those um, those venomous spines. Of course, all of the chondrichthyan fishes have internal fertilization, so they mate by inserting a clasper into the female, and so mating. We don't know how mating takes place in a lot of chondrichthyan fishes, sharks, and rays. This is a rendition from a paper about 40 years ago that from Cownose rays in Japan, illustrating how they mate. But it wasn't observed in the wild, or at least not documented until recently. This paper just came out a few years ago. It was in New Jersey where they actually observed mating in three species of rays, including Cownose rays. And so you can see here, you got multiple males and females together in sort of a mating ball. And then eventually when they come together, a pair will come together and they kind of flutter to the bottom while copulation is taking place. To me, the coolest thing biologically about the stingrays, the myliobatiform rays, and I know this is kind of gross, but I've got lots and lots of gross photos that I didn't put in here. The is the way that their embryos are nourished during development. It's probably the most advanced form of embryonic development in the animal kingdom. It's an extreme form of matrotrophy. Matrotrophy means mom feeding, maternal feeding. And what happens in these stingrays is the embryo uses its yolk sac initially, like every other, pretty much every other vertebrate, but then after that, the mom's uterine wall, that's what you're looking at right here, gets these long finger-like extensions called trophinomata. Now, this is a female that has just given birth, and so hers are deep red. They're deep red before they start producing milk and deep red after they give birth. They will later get engorged with histotroph, which is a lipid-rich uterine milk. And that's what's happening here. You can see they're bright pink now, and there's a little embryo right in there. And that embryo basically has these trophinomata, these little finger-like extensions, are in its mouth and its spiracles and its gill slits, and they're forced to drink just copious amounts of this really high energy, high calorie lipid rich milk, uterine milk, and so they end up producing very large offspring. I would say it's probably it's on par with placental mammal birth in terms of maternal input, how much the mom gives to the embryos. And in the case of the Cownose rays, just like the mantas, they are extremely conservative in their life history, and that after all of this, they give birth to a single pup. The Cownose rays produce one pup after a gestation period of about 11 months. And then they mate again, wait 11 months, they give birth to another single pup. Keep that in mind. That's going to come back here in a little bit. Of course, the Cownose rays are also in a couple of families that are known for having these really big heavy duty jaws with plate-like teeth for crushing hard prey. These are the jaws of a cownose ray here. Rhinoptera bonasus is the species of cownose ray we have, or the most common species we have at least. And so these are what are called durophagus rays. Durophagus rays, right down in here, all have these really heavy duty jaws for crushing hard prey. This is a paper that my student Matt Coleman and I did a few years ago. He's now a professor at Louisville University, looking at the functional morphology of and the structure of the muscles and skeletal elements of all the different batoids. And in this, you can see, here's some skates and butterfly rays up top. Down here is like your southern stingray, but in the middle, you've got your durophagus rays with your cownose rays right here on the right-hand side. And just notice how huge the muscles are attached to this jaw. So they have these huge hypertrophied muscles and these heavy-duty jaw structures for crushing hard prey. Now remember, they're a cartilaginous fish. They're made of cartilage. They will actually crush things that are harder than their own skeleton. That's a hard evolutionary trick to overcome. And they do it with these big, huge muscles, these very strong jaws. They'll even use sort of a nutcracker model by anchoring one side of the jaw to create leverage to crush hard prey. And this is one of the issues, of course, that one of the characteristics that gets them in trouble in terms of conflict with humans, as we'll talk about. So the species we're talking about now is Rhinoptera bonasus. It's not particularly sexy of a species. Rhinoptera, rhino means snout, ptera means wing, so snout wing. Well, that's fine. Its snout goes right into its pectoral fin, so that makes sense. But in case you don't know, a bonasus is a beast like a bull that uses its dung as a weapon. According to Pliny the Elder, about the first century, he claimed that the contact with the dung would burn you like you were touched by fire. And so, not particularly sexy name, Rhinoptera bonasus. But nevertheless, so keep that in mind too when we talk about the efforts to rename cownose rays to something else, like Sunshine Ray or Chesapeake Ray later on. But they're way more elegant of an animal than this would give lure to. I mean, obviously, I think that reproductive biology is super, super cool. But they've also got all kind of little tricks up their sleeves, and we're just now touching on figuring out more and more about the biology of these animals. And I'll show you some stuff in a little bit. But this is a paper that came out recently that out of George Lauder's lab that showed that cownose rays, basically that long tail that they have serves almost like an antenna. They have these lateral line canals and free neuromass that go down the length of that tail. You see a cownose ray swimming, and you might think, how in the world would it ever detect a potential predator coming up from behind? Turns out they have these really cool lateral line pores in their tail for detecting when something's coming up behind them, which is super cool. Neat new paper. Okay, for the interest of time, that's all I'm going to talk about with the general biology of what is a cownose ray. So now let's move on to cownose rays in Chesapeake Bay. A little bit about their distribution, their population levels. So Chesapeake Bay has been the summer home to millions of cownose rays for a very, very long time. This is a paper by Ben Blaylock, who was a student at VIMS in the 80s. He used aerial surveys from their little otter seaplane to look at the schools of cownose rays entering Chesapeake Bay off Cape Charles. And he found that there were schools that were 1,100 acres wide. So 1,100 acres of cownose rays entering the the bay. He estimated the average school size was about 5 million rays. In September, up to about 9 million rays coming into Chesapeake Bay. And this is in the 80s. So I put that in there just to illustrate that they've been coming into Chesapeake Bay a very, very long time. And there's a lot of them. Now, this is a relatively new paper that came out by Chuck Bangley and colleagues at the Smithsonian Institute looking at the seasonal movements of cownose rays. So cownose rays are in Chesapeake Bay primarily in the summer, and they do go all the way up into the upper Chesapeake Bay, but most of their summer distribution is in the lower bay in Virginia waters. Um, During the winter, though, they leave the bay. They can't tolerate, they're a subtropical species, really. They can't tolerate the low temperatures. And so they go down all the way down to Florida, mostly around Cape Canaveral in the wintertime. Um, and then they come back the following summer. So they're a highly migratory species that moves back and forth along the East Coast from Virginia, Maryland, even beyond that slightly down to Florida. And they can move beyond this too. This is a paper that Bob Fisher and a student published using satellite telemetry to look at movements of cownose rays. And you can see that some of them venture way beyond Chesapeake Bay. Some of them go up to Massachusetts occasionally. Some of them go relatively far offshore. And so they're pretty wide ranging in their movements. Now, in terms of a historical perspective in Chesapeake Bay, um, they've always been there. Regardless of what, some people may have you believe, it's not a recent invasion of cownose rays. John Smith in 1608 talks about how their captain would go out and kill enough rays in an afternoon to feed all of their troops in an hour, and you could kill enough to feed all of their troops and so um, and so they've always been there. Mitchell in 1815 talks about cownose rays being detested by people living near the shores because they were eating soft-shell clams, Maya arenaria. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Joseph, 1961, talks about having these huge concentrations of cownose rays. Frank Schwartz in 1965 talked about huge flotillas of cownose rays in the upper bay, witnessed 200,000 in caught in a pound net in the Potomac River. Um, In fact, we can go back even further than this. Um, Cownose ray plates are among the most common ray teeth you see in Virginia and Maryland and North Carolina waters, or sediments, dating all the way back to 50 million years. And so they've been coming to Chesapeake Bay for a very, very long time. And so um, in contrast to this idea that made it into a lot of media a few years ago that cownose rays were invaders into Chesapeake Bay. They're not some alien invader. They've been there all along. You like my little alien antenna on my cownose ray? I thought that was pretty clever. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, but because of this, this issue of um, there's a long history in the last, say, 50 years of interactions and conflict between watermen in Chesapeake Bay and cownose rays. All the way back to 1975, there were oyster growers that requested aid to control predation by cownose rays. Um, and so they were reporting substantial losses of seed and harvestable oysters. And of course, this is in the 70s when oyster populations, the oyster stock had already declined significantly, and we're moving towards on-bottom aquaculture, seeding it with seed and spat. And so they recommended at the time a number of things. This is in the 70s, including developing a fishery for cownose rays, developing sport fishing derbies. I will say that they recommended waiting until after they pup before they did the sport fishing derbies, which is something that doesn't happen today. This was in Virginia. In North Carolina, in the same time period, there were also reports of losses of bay scallops to cownose ray, and they proposed a fishery and tried to develop a market for cownose rays way back then. And so this became a pretty heated issue even back in the 70s. In fact, this is a quote from an oyster biologist at VIMS in 1982, J.D. Andrews. that said, I suggest that a communication network of oystermen, fishermen, and police departments hooked to the Virginia Commission of Fisheries, that's the VMRC, be established to report occurrences of schools of rays. Then crews of hull seiners can be called out to surround the catch and catch the rays. And they basically said he said if the fish can be marketed, fine, but otherwise destroy them. So the oyster fishery is far more valuable than any quantity of rays. Was what a oyster biologist said in the early 1980s. 1984, again, oyster growers in the Rappahannock requested that VMRC revisit the Cownose ray issue. They claimed that 83 was the worst year for loss of their planted oysters. 1989, they again lobbied Congress to do something about Cownose ray. This is from the Marine Resources Advisory at VIMS. They had articles on how to clean and cook Cownose rays back in the 1980s there. 1993, it came up again. Cownose rays, nothing but trouble for the bay, came up. Um, and so again, they claimed that it's a huge issue. 1998, again, the oyster industry asked that the Cownose ray working group be resurrected to revisit this Cownose ray issue. And now keep in mind, this is an issue primarily because the oyster stocks and scallop populations in Virginia, in North Carolina, had already declined so much that they were purporting that the Cownose rays were basically negatively affecting their ability to seed beds with and grow out oysters um, with on-bottom aquaculture. Now that's 93, 98. I got involved with this in 2006. This was resurrected again. There was a regional workshop in Yorktown, Virginia, to talk about the Cownose ray issue. This is the agenda from that workshop. There were 8 talks on Cownose ray interactions with the bivalve fisheries. There were 5 talks on the Cownose ray market and developing a fishery for them. There was 1 talk on the biology and the need for caution if you're going to develop a fishery for the species, and that was me in 2006. And I was urging them that, this is nothing new. There's this history of these interactions. I also urged them to look at the life history of Cownose rays producing a single pup per year. Um, some of these market developers, the Virginia Marine Resource Committee, Virginia was sending an envoy to South Korea to develop markets for Cownose ray wings from Chesapeake Bay. And the whole reason that there was a need for Cownose ray wings in South Korea is because their supply from Brazil was exhausted because the species was now endangered. And so I pointed all this out in 2006 that this was an issue. And I also pointed out that this may have some unforeseen consequences, um, highlighting this study in California with the California bat ray, where California batways were perceived to be eating all the oysters on their oyster beds. Um, but biologists went out and harvested, and they started harvesting the fishery started doing culling of the bat rays. And the biologist looked in the guts of 500 bat rays and found out they're not eating oysters. And as a matter of fact, they're eating these cankered crabs, cancer, which are major oyster predators. And so you're shooting yourself in the foot. And so they were actually going out to the fishermen were setting traps to catch the crabs because the crabs were eating their oysters and bat rays to catch them because they thought they were eating their oysters, even though the bat rays are eating the crabs. That is the problem. So there can be unforeseen consequences. Well, among the talks at this workshop in 2006 was a talk on this trophic cascade right here from Pete Peterson, was from University of North Carolina. Cascading effects of loss of apex predatory sharks in the coastal ocean. And so that leads me to the third and longest part of this, as the whole trophic cascades and Cownose ray scapegoats issue. So this is the paper that came out in Science magazine in 2007, was presented at that workshop. And basically what the premise of the paper was that drastic losses of large coastal sharks from overfishing had, through predation released, allowed a whole bunch of mesopredatory elasmobranchs, so smaller sharks and rays, their populations to explode, including cownose rays, and that the explosion of cownose rays had led to the collapse of the North Carolina Bay scallop fishery. This is our rebuttal to that paper in scientific reports. And so I'm going to basically give you some of the details of this, of our rebuttal. So this classic kind of top-down trophic cascade has been sort of a holy grail in marine ecosystems for decades. The idea of trophic cascades comes from rocky intertidal communities where you have very linear food webs, where you have one species of sea star that's feeding on the mussels and it's feeding on or whatever. And so it's these linear kind of effects. Um, but it's also apparent in some, terrestrial environments. So, the classic Yellowstone, the wolves, have some sort of top-down pressure on things like elk and if they don't control the elk populations, then they overgraze the woody plants and then overgraze pastures and all these other kinds of things. Top-down trophic cascades. Well, when I first started teaching shark biology, I used to use this all the time and say that sharks are the lions of the Serengeti, the wolves of Yellowstone. They have these top-down influences on marine ecosystems. The truth is, most marine ecosystems are so complex that you don't get these really linear top-down effects. And so that all was grossly exaggerated, but people were still really looking for evidence for this top-down control in large marine ecosystems. And so this paper that came out in Science was the first, gave everybody that this is it. Everybody just grabbed hold of it because this is it. This is our first evidence of this top-down trophic cascade because of loss of sharks. And so this trophic cascade in that paper got parroted in all kinds of different papers. Here's one by Heithaus et al. That shows that exact trophic cascade from that paper, from the Science paper, saying, for example, that loss of blacktip sharks led to explosion of cownose rays, and that led to collapses of scallop populations. And this paper by Julia Baum and Boris Worm, they extended this all the way to oysters, bay scallops, hard clams, and soft shell clams. So now the oysters are responsible for all of those things too. I mean, the cownose rays are responsible for all of those things too. There's a book on trophic cascades edited by Jim Turberg and Jim Estes, John Turberg. Jim Estes is, if you've ever read the anything about the orca, sea otter, urchin, kelp trophic cascade, that's what his claim to fame. In that book, they have a whole chapter on trophic cascades in high latitude coastal oceans, and they dedicate 25% of that chapter to this same trophic cascade from the Science paper. Now, this chapter is written by Jim Estes, Pete Peterson, who was the lead author on that paper, and Bob Stenick. And the first time I gave this rebuttal to that paper was at a symposium where these three guys were the keynote speakers, and Jim Estes was the one who had to introduce me, knowing I was about to rebut a whole bunch of their stuff. Um, so the crux of our rebuttal was that we actually, we already knew that these shark populations were under fisheries management. And so we knew that these declines were not as severe as reported. That's what tipped us off to begin with. And so we asked, are these declines of sharks as severe as reported? Do they eat these things at a large enough, portion of their diet to elicit the cascade? Are the increase in all of these smaller species of sharks and rays even credible? And then finally, are the cownose rays responsible for this collapse of this bivalve stock? And I'm going to really shorten this for this talk some, but um, the large coastal sharks, as I mentioned, by this time this paper came out, the large coastal shark populations, which were heavily overfished in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they had been heavily managed since the early 1990s and were being managed as with a quota that was less than 10% of the maximum landings by 2004. In that trophic cascade paper, they didn't even acknowledge that any of these sharks were under management and didn't even use any of the data sets that looked at their population levels. Instead, they chose one data set, a shark survey in the University of North Carolina, to tell their story. The owner of this data set, Frank Schwartz, was not on the paper. He refused to be on the paper because he knew they were not using his data properly. And so they basically said that these sharks all declined by somewhere between 87 and 99 percent. And I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'll just point out some flaws in this idea. They had a 32-year data set, which is a pretty long data set, but some of them had really low sample sizes. For example, they reported that smooth hammerheads had declined by 99%, and there'd only been 5 ever caught in the whole survey in 32 years. 23 bull sharks in 32 years. Drawing some kind of inference to the changes in population based on these such low sample sizes is that's flawed. In addition, they ignored other data sets that challenged their assertion. For example, they said there's a 97% decline in tiger sharks. There's a NOAA survey that showed a huge increase in tiger sharks following management. And in fact, one of the co-authors on papers showed an increase in tiger sharks and didn't acknowledge it. Um, but we chose in our paper to concentrate on the 3 most common species, which are also the ones that you do have large sample sizes for and that are made part of the large coastal fishery and are under management: sandbar sharks, blacktips, and duskies. And for our comparison, they said in the survey that they used, the only data set they used only had 2 stations off North Carolina for highly migratory species, which isn't enough. They used that and claimed that because it's in the migration route, any trends with these North Carolina data should follow the population level trend. And so that's fair enough assumption. Well, I was at the time running the VIM survey that has a few more stations, but has a similar longevity since the early 70s. And so we chose to compare these 2 data sets, acknowledging that neither data set in itself should be used for a stock assessment. You should use all the available data. And so we found that they're very different trends. In reality, what had happened is due to warming temperatures, Virginia by the 1990s was North Carolina in the 1970s, and a lot of these species were shifting north. And so while we saw the same trend in North Carolina for blacktip sharks that they saw, this huge decline, in Virginia by the late 2000s, you were catching more blacktip sharks than ever. Similar kind of trend for sandbar sharks. Sandbar sharks showed a huge decline due to the fishery in the VIM survey, but were on their way to recovery by the late 2000s. We again saw the same decline in North Carolina they saw. Dusky sharks. If you chose the North Carolina survey, you would say, yeah, dusky sharks are probably going extinct. But if you chose the VIM survey, you would see this huge decline, and then following fishery management, they're fully recovered according to the VIM survey. The truth is neither are the full picture. You have to use all of the available data sets, and these are the data sets that were used through 2009 for the stock assessment. Now, the stock assessment did suggest that dusky sharks are in bad shape. They were in the worst shape of any of our large coastal sharks because they have a 20-year they take 20 years to mature, and they only reproduce every 3 years. So they're very vulnerable. Keep that in mind. And so while it did suggest that the abundance of dusky sharks had declined by somewhere between 60 and 80%, even at that most severe level, 80% is very, very different than 99%. 80% the difference between 99% and 80% is a 2,000 fold, 2,000% or 20-fold difference in the remaining population. So the number of females available for recovery of that population, the difference between 80 and 99%. So while 80% is certainly of concern, it's way different than the 99% that that paper suggested. So no, the declines are not as severe as reported. How about these trophic links to the other species and the increases in the small elasmobranchs? Now, I'm not going to go through a lot of this, but just point out a couple of highlights. For one, I don't know. I'm simple. I live out in the country. Maybe I don't know any better. But in my mind, for a predator to cause predation release on prey, they actually have to overlap with those prey, meaning they actually have to be in the same habitat to eat them. But apparently, some of them can eat by telekinesis or something. I don't know, because there are some species that were in this paper that don't even overlap with the sharks that supposedly cause their trophic release. So how did they eat them if they don't even co-occur? There are some other species that they cherry pick data to show the increases they wanted to show. In this case of little skates, they basically put two different gear types together to show this from a NIMS inshore trawl survey to show this increase. The data before this green line and after this green line are not comparable. The stock assessment science won't compare them because they're completely different surveys. And in fact, this species that they suggested had exploded is subject to one of the largest fisheries of sharks or rays in the United States. It's a huge skate fishery, mostly for bait, for lobster bait. And in fact, this species is teetering right between overfished and not overfished. Much it's never been exploded. Now, and this is one of the ones that don't overlap with those species of sharks anyway. Now, there are species of sharks and rays, and I could show you a bunch of them that do overlap with those sharks that they could have looked at. And in fact, they did look at one of them, clear-nosed skate. Anybody in Chesapeake Bay may know what a clear-nosed skate is. They're really common in the lower bay. They lay eggs down there in the spring. Clear-nosed skate, these are some I pulled out of the guts of large coastal sharks, of dusky sharks. They definitely get eaten. So why didn't they use the clear nose skate? Oh, well, it turns out they did look at clear nose skate, but it didn't tell the story that they wanted to tell because they looked at five different data sets. Two of them showed an increase in the skates, one showed a decline in the skates, and two showed no trend. So it didn't tell the story, so they put the little skate that doesn't even overlap with the sharks in there anyway. That's unethical. What about cownose rays? So the Cownose rays, they did have four different data sets that all showed an increase in Cownose rays. They looked at seven data sets. One showed a decline, three showed modest increases, and three showed pretty large increases. One of the issues with it, they chose to highlight the ones with the highest increases in the paper and ignored the ones with the lower increases or the decrease. But one of the issues with this is that cownose rays, as we mentioned, they travel in schools of tens to hundreds of thousands. And so most fishery independent surveys like trawls and long lines, things like that, they don't capture their abundance very well at all. And so we don't really have a good view of their abundance. And so, if you look at these sample sizes, 76 over 24 years, 230 over 17 years, 11 over 35 years. Those are really low sample sizes for trying to estimate the change in a population of a species that travels in schools of tens to hundreds of thousands. And so we looked at it anyway and compared these increases with life history. And so what this would require is that cownose rays replace themselves at about 8.7% per year, and that they have a 92.3% annual survival. That's an extremely high number for any shark or ray. And so we wondered if this is even possible. Of course, there's an alternative explanation even for these increases, and that's that the population distribution has shifted north just like all the sharks did. But anyway, this set us on a path to look at life histories of these species of the Cownose rays. And so there was already a fishery starting, and so we took Cownose rays from the fishery and did an age and growth study, one of the largest age and growth studies of any shark or ray. We aged the vertebrae. You can section the vertebrae of a shark or ray like into a thin section, and this is half of a thin section, and you can count the rings like on a tree, and that can give you an idea of the age. And so these are counting the rings of the tree. Using that, we looked at over 500 vertebral samples from rays caught in the fishery, and we figured out that they mature in about 6 or 7 years, which is pretty common for rays. It's relatively slow maturing, but not as slow as many of the large sharks. But then we also looked at their life history, their fecundity. Bob Fisher looked at 400 term pregnant females and found that 97.7% had single pups. There were 2% that had twins. Usually those twins were very small and probably wouldn't survive. What this means is that their lifetime fecundity, because our maximum age of a Cownose ray we found was about 22 years. That means the lifetime fecundity, the lifetime number of offspring a Cownose ray will produce is 15. One of the tenets of trophic cascades is that the life history of your predator has to be slower than your prey. In other words, your prey have to be able to reproduce faster than the predator in order for that population explosion to take place. The large sharks that are at the top of that food chain produce over 100 pups in their lifetime. The Cownose raise less than 15. So it violates one of the tenets of trophic cascades to begin with. Turns out Cownose rays have among the lowest uh, population increase rates of any vertebrates. They're right down here at 1, which means that they barely replace themselves. Our population average, instead of being point uh, an intrinsic rate of increase of 0.087 is 0.008. That means they're basically barely replacing themselves. So they're among one of the most least productive of all elasmobranchs. So they're not capable of exploding, of their populations exploding. So there's some other explanation. Well, what about this whole increased Cownose ray? Even if you bought into this idea that Cownose rays exploded, this idea that they're responsible for the collapse of commercial bivalve populations. So this is from that bomb in that paper that used those same data from the Myers paper. And there's one thing that I don't get here that can't believe the reviewers didn't pick up on, that this decline is responsible for this increase, and this increase is responsible for this decline. These don't overlap. So somehow, like Terminator, Cownose rays came back from the future, and these Cownose rays came back from the 2000s, came back to the 80s to eat all these scallops and cause the collapse of this population. It just doesn't match up. And in fact, in our paper, when we looked at um, the Cownose rays, if you use the North Carolina data set, you do see this kind of trophic cascade effect. But if you use the VIMS data set, it looks like Cownose rays and sharks are increasing at the same time. So the whole argument falls apart. So it depends on what data set you cherry pick to tell the story. And of course, we know that different things like in North Carolina, wasting disease in 1937, killing seagrasses, red tides, or 1937, red tides, hurricanes causing recruitment failure. There are lots, and plus an unregulated recreational fishery. There are lots of things that cause the collapse of scallop populations in North Carolina. Same with Chesapeake Bay oyster populations. These are harvests of oysters. This should tell you what caused the decline of the oysters right here. It's not these Cownose rays here at the end. It's harvests and disease, habitat loss, pollution, and lots of other things. And so in our paper, we looked at this, and you can see that in all cases, the Cownose ray supposed increase is after the scallops and the oysters had collapsed. And of course, the oysters and scallops had collapsed in areas where there are no Cownose rays too, up in Massachusetts. What about them eating commercial bivalves? In some cases, they do. In Chesapeake Bay, particular, but in most places they don't really eat. I mean, not in Chesapeake Bay, in North Carolina particularly, they do eat bay scallops. They're tasty. Why wouldn't they? They're soft, relatively soft-shelled and tasty. In Chesapeake Bay, historically, they did eat a lot of soft-shell clams. Of course, soft-shell clams, because of a lot of different reasons, have pretty much disappeared from the bay for a century now, because of disease and recruitment failure and a whole bunch of other things. They did eat soft shell clams, but very few oysters or hard clams. And in fact, most the cownose rays eat relatively soft-bodied prey. This is in Florida. They're eating mostly little crustaceans, polychaetes, non-commercial bivalves. This is in the Gulf of Mexico. Also, they're eating things like sand dollars and tiny little non-commercial bivalves, polychaetes, no commercial bivalves. And in fact, in Chesapeake Bay, when we had this grant to look at this, Bob Fisher, who was working with me, and he looked at the diet of hundreds of cownose rays that were caught in the fishery, caught on oyster beds. And even those that are caught on oyster beds only had about 5% oysters. So they weren't eating a whole lot of oysters. Now, we also looked at, can a Cownose ray even eat an oyster? And of course, if you give a predator enough time, they can eat them. And in on-bottom aquaculture, if you're seeding the bottom with millions and millions of little tiny seed oysters like Skittles from heaven, every predator is going to eat those, of course. Um, but I'm gonna rush through this because I know I'm running out of time. Basically, we looked at the jaw gape and the size of the oysters, the shell depth, and whether they could be eaten. And there's basically a size where the Cownose rays can't open their mouth wide enough to even eat the oysters, and that's concomitant with this is the crush strength required to crush an adult oyster shell, or an oyster shell, as a function of the size of the oyster. This is the same for hard clams. There reaches a peak, a point here at about 26 millimeters of shell depth. It's a relatively small oyster that they can't open their mouth wide enough, nor can they bite hard enough to eat an oyster or a hard clam. So protect them until they reach that size in on-bottom aquaculture, and they can't be eaten by cownose rays. We also looked at the feeding biomechanics of the cownose rays and looked at how much bite force they have compared with the strength it requires to crush an oyster. And it's about 200 newtons of strength that they have in their jaws. If you look at the strength required to crush an oyster here, you know, this is the very highest load of an oyster, of a cownose ray. It's 600 newtons. Most of the time they're down here at 200 newtons. So it's really only the very smallest oysters that they're capable of eating. We did this with a whole bunch of other species of bivalves, commercial and non-commercial as well, to look at basically the gape limit idea that they're, above a certain size, the Cownose rays just can't eat them. And a lot of this, animus towards Cownose rays, of course, it ignores other potential predators. For example, a black drum that you can catch in Chesapeake Bay, by the time it's 10 pounds, 12 pounds, has a bite force high enough to eat any oyster. And they do. That's what they eat, is oysters. And so, drums are probably responsible uh, for more oyster mortality than Cownose rays in some places. And of course, the biggest source of mortality for scallops and oysters is us harvesting them. So, in conclusion from that part, the decline of sharks was not as severe as reported. The trophic links are not sufficient to link that to elicit that cascade. We don't think these increases are consistent with biology, and we don't think that the collapse of the bivalve populations was because of cownose rays. And so quickly for the last part of this, what's the cascading effect of this? And that's the save the bay, eat a ray idea. And these are photos of Chesapeake Bay cownose rays that Sonia Fordham from Shark Advocates International, I think she's in on this talk, sent me. Sonia's been at the forefront of shark and ray conservation for about 30, 40 years now. So I always like to give a shout out to her outfit there if you want to support any NGOs that are doing shark conservation work. Um, this is from the Boston Seafood Show. This is in Brussels. Brussels. They've got Cownose rays from Chesapeake Bay. Of course, Cownose isn't a very appealing name, so they changed the name to Chesapeake ray instead, or Sunshine Ray. And so the Save the Bay Eater Ray phenomenon started, and all of a sudden it became this media craziness that cownose rays were some invasive species that were just eating all the species we want to eat. Here's a in this art in this magazine here, they list cownose rays as one of the 10 invasive species that cost the US a bundle. They're not invasive. They've been here for 50 million years. National Geographic even got in on it. Ida Bay Save the Ray. We found out this was coming out, and we sent them a draft of we sent them our paper, and they at least put a question mark. They originally didn't have a question mark, and that's National Geographic. This is the virginiaseafood.org website. You could go on there and you could order, you used to get recipes for cownose ray. You could order wings. You could order steak. You could order them for bait. One of the most vulnerable species of vertebrates on the planet that produces one pup per year. We're going to use it as crab pot bait. That seems to make a lot of sense. And in fact, if you go on there right now today, they've got a whole thing on fact sheet on eating cownose rays. There's a huge effort to develop a fishery for them. Going green with Chesapeake Ray, the next calamari. So it's promoted as being sustainable. You know, this is from a restaurant in Virginia Beach that claims to only serve sustainable seafood, and they were promoting cultured oysters with a side of Cownose Ray as an eat a ray, save the bay appetizer. Food Network. Do you love your oyster scallops and clams? Want to do your bit to balance the environment? Here's your chance. Save the bay, eat a ray. So this paper in Science, all of a sudden, for decades, people have been trying to develop a fishery for this species because of these interactions with on-bottom aquaculture. But cooler heads always prevailed. But now, because this one paper in Science gave them the credibility to do it, this took off. Will you eat a Cownose ray? Virginia hopes so. It also led to development of bow fishing tournaments, primarily in Virginia, but also in Maryland, where people would go out and just shoot cownose rays. And unlike the tournaments that were proposed in the 70s, these tournaments were generally done right when this cownose rays enter the bay, when the females are still pregnant, so that when you killed a cownose ray, if it was female, you were killing her pup too. And so it was truly an attempt at an eradication program. Um, and so there are all kind of people getting in on this. It became just a vogue thing to charter captains to go out and shoot cownose ray. There's a TV show that's kind of like a Jersey Shore thing called Party Down South that was on TV that had a whole episode on shooting rays. In 2010, the American Elasmobranch Society, which is the largest scientific society dedicated to the study of constricting fishes, their conservation committee put together a resolution regarding Atlantic cownose rays, which was sent to all of the fishery managers and it basically urged the Atlantic states where cownose rays are being landed, particularly Virginia and Maryland, to impose some precautionary catch limits because of this really conservative life history and vulnerable life history, and for them to do a population assessment. Nothing really happened for a while. That was in 2010. There started getting more media coverage of these bow fishing tournaments. This one was by a really well-known outdoor writer um, he interviewed me, and I'm a bow hunter. I only eat meat that I harvest, and I said in there that my granddad would have taken his belt to me if I'd done anything like this because we weren't allowed to kill anything we don't eat. You know, this is another one that there was an interview on NPR about it, about targeting cownose rays with these sport so-called sport. I mean, it's not a sport. Anybody can kill a cownose ray. It's a fish in a barrel. Um, this paper came out and got a lot of publicity. Killing contests that target pregnant females, threaten to wipe out this graceful ocean animal. This was also written by Ted Williams, a well-known outdoor writer. But it really wasn't until some animal rights groups went out and started filming the tournaments and the brutality of it that people took notice and the managers took notice. because there became an outcry. And so in 2015, there finally was a Cownose ray um, uh, workshop to look at developing a management plan. I was there, Sonny Fordham was there, and we all presented and worked with the Virginia Marine Resource Commission and the Maryland Department of Natural Resources on this. And so this was um, a positive development. Our paper came out the next year in 2016. I presented it at that meeting. After our paper challenging that trophic cascade came out, there was quite a bit of publicity. New research challenges the cascading effects. Study challenges blaming rays for Chesapeake oyster collapse. That was news from Maryland. Um, Study Cownose rays not the bad guys overall. After all, um, account and Bay. This is in the Bay Journal. So these are people on the Bay who read these publications. Cownose rays not to blame for shellfish decline. This is in Discover magazine. Ray fillets won't save the Bay. We exonerated them. The veal of the sea. Meanwhile, this is on the Chesapeake on the Virginia Resource Commission website. Smithsonian, the Cownose rays acquitted, and even Science magazine, innocent until proven guilty. They did put. You notice our paper was not published in Science. They didn't want to publish a paper challenging their own paper, and so but they did highlight it once it was published somewhere else. So there's some positive development after that. Maryland stepped up to the plate and passed a moratorium in 2017 banning the tournaments, and so that banned the killing of Cownose rays. Um, Thanks to Sonia Fordham, we in prep for this talk, we reached out, or she reached out to figure out if this is, 'cause it's hard to figure out if this is still in place. And this is what we got back from Maryland DNR, that they are still prohibited, had been, the ray tournaments have been prohibited since 2017. It's a $1,000 fine for a first offense, $2,000 fines, and 1 year in jail for a second offense. Um, and the management plan draft is ready to be sent out finally. I mean, we're 10 years later from when we did that meeting, unfortunately, but at least there is some movement to get a management plan. And so thanks to Sonia for making sure we got all the information. But this is just Maryland. And remember that they spend more time in Virginia than they do in Maryland, and they go all the way down to Florida. So right now, Maryland at least has some momentum. They have a draft management plan that needs to be finalized, and the bow fishing tournament is is they are banned. You could, if you want to, Governor Moore would probably like to hear something about this. He'd probably be interested in seeing that management plan finalized. But in Virginia to Florida, there's no management. They're unregulated species, to my knowledge, at least. Now, unregulated species in Florida doesn't mean completely unregulated. All the rays, any unregulated species, you're limited to 2 fish or 100 pounds per person per day. So that means that legally you could kill, 2 or 3 cownose rays a day, but at least you can't kill, dozens like happened in Virginia. Virginia, those tournaments that people still kill lots of them in Virginia. Of course, you know, harvest is prohibited for spotted eagle rays in Florida. Why spotted eagle rays, not cownose rays? We like to say pretty things, fluffy things, furry things, cute things. But cownose rays have a more conservative life history and more vulnerable life history than the eagle rays. And so if these are prohibited, they should be too. And of course, manta rays, everybody loves a manta. I mean, I'd like to refer to them as dolphins with wings. And so everybody loves a manta. And of course, they're listed under the ESA as threatened. And so they're protected federally. And of course, our cownose rays are a highly migratory species that has a life history just like a manta ray, 1 pup per year. And so, in reality, our cownose rays need regional management and conservation of all the states involved, and they are highly migratory species. So, NOAA and the Management Council should be involved in this as well. And so I know I went a little bit over time. I will leave you with a species of shark that does eat cownose rays. They leave them. Sphaeronum macaron, the great hammerhead species, was not in that trophic cascade paper. And I'm happy to take any questions. I know I went a bit over there.
Wow, Dean, that was amazing. That was like so many layers of.
Yeah, there's too many layers, I'm sure.
No, 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 not too many. I mean, it's a fascinating story that is so relevant in a variety of different ways. Let me open it up to.
I'm glad Russell says it didn't have too many layers. That's good.
Okay, I'd love to open it up for questions. If you want to put a question in the chat box, that's fine, or you can raise your hand and I can call and you can talk directly. Let's see what we have here. Okay, Randy's question, having difficulty reconciling the 97% annual survival rate with the 1 pup per year replacement rate with a lifetime capacity to have 15 pups. Seems to me the potential for stock to increase year over year is real, but you imply that they're barely hanging on.
So, so the so I don't know that they're barely hanging on. We don't have a stock assessment. I'm saying we don't know. We need to know. But in terms of the increase, the 97% survival rate, there's no shark array that has a 97% annual survival rate, not even the largest sharks, and so there was an 87% that they were recommending. But the estimates are that it's more on the lines of in year one, there's probably something like a 50% survival rate and then a 75% survival rate. So there's attrition associated with that. We don't really know what the survival rate is, but I can tell you from the ones that had been tagged, a significant and these are all adults, a significant proportion of them get eaten every year by sharks. And so the survival rate is probably way lower than even 75% per year for those adults. Um, and so yeah, so that's where if you draw that out to the infinite rate of population increase of the population, you get a roughly, a 0.1%. They're right at a stable distribution. They are a species that evolved essentially to maintain a stable population.
Lloyd and Peter both are on the same question strand about Virginia. Any movement at all? Or are there
Not
any conservation groups in Virginia?
No, 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 no movement that I can see. I tried to find out if anything's happening, and you can barely find a mention of Cownose rays on the VMRC website. They're still an unregulated species there. Um, it does seem that the Cownose ray tournaments, I think they've received so much negative press that either they're not happening as much or they're not as visible. Um, and because they used to promote them all over, social media and the internet and everything else, and you just don't see that anymore. So I don't know if the tournaments have. It seems that the tournaments are at least aren't occurring as much as they used to. But Virginia's shown, as far as I can see, no interest in managing Cownose rays.
Are there any use of drones? You mentioned the planes. Are they using drones to do any aerial surveys?
I don't know of anybody doing that. They could be. I mean, it would certainly be way less expensive than flying airplanes. But the problem with those aerial surveys in murky water, like in Chesapeake Bay, is that I don't think that, if you remember that the aerial survey data I showed from Ben Blaylock with those millions of animals entering the bay, um, there are huge error bars associated with it. And those error bars generally, there'll be an estimate for like September of 9 million, but it could be somewhere between 500,000 and 30 million. And part of the problem is in murky water, you're only really seeing what's on the surface, and they do travel a lot on the surface, but you don't know how many stacks there are. You don't know if there's one below the top one or two or three or what there is. So aerial survey, it's a really difficult problem. We've struggled with this to figure out how do you actually estimate the population size of a species like that? In other species that travel in huge schools, they're more susceptible to things like, trawls or halsanes, but Cownose rays really are too big for that. And so we really don't have a good way of estimating what the population is or what the population trends are.
Well, Jillian and Samuel have kind of the same question here. Has there been any data collected on how important the cownose rays are for the survival of sharks? So it's the opposite. If they are significant food source, could shark declines, could ray declines impact the populations of vulnerable sharks?
Yeah, it's sort of a bottom up approach. I mean, I think other, um, rays and sharks make up a really small portion of the diet, even of species that like bull sharks and great hammerheads that eat a lot of them. They mostly eat bony fish. And so and of course it's one of the reasons why Chesapeake Bay is where the cownose rays come into pup, is because there are very few large sharks in Chesapeake Bay. There are thousands of sandbar shark babies. I tagged like 6,000 of them in Chesapeake Bay, but there are very few big sharks. And so the pups are pretty protected in there until they leave. And once they leave, that's when all of our tagging data suggests they get eaten. But it would probably be, from a up standpoint, there are many other commercially and recreationally important fishes that sharks eat that are a much bigger uh, part of their diet. So those would be the ones that could have some bottom up influence.
Rachel asked, do the cownose rays eat horseshoe crabs?
Not that I'm aware of, but I've never seen horseshoe crabs in any of the diet studies. I mean, they could certainly eat the little juveniles, um, not the big ones. But even here in the study that was done here, there's two studies done here in the Gulf of Mexico where there are lots of horseshoe crabs, and we see lots of little babies in the sandy intertidal zone. Cownose rays, the diet studies never showed horseshoe crabs in their diet, but certainly no reason why they couldn't eat a horseshoe crab, up until the size of a silver dollar or something.
What about ASMFC? I'm not sure what that acronym is, but are they taking a position?
Yes, that's the Atlantic States Fishery Management Commission. Um, so far, and Sonia's still here probably, and she can chime in and correct me if I'm wrong. But you know, so you have these regional management councils. AFMFC is one of them, and then you have, of course, NOAA that HMS that normally regulates highly migratory species. None of the regional management councils or NOAA HMS have really wanted to touch cownose ray management. So far, there's been an interest of just leaving it to the states. And of course, as I showed, they're a highly migratory species, so it really should be either the management councils or HMS. Sonia, did I get that right? Has ASMSC had any interest in managing them?
Small correction, thank you.
Yep.
Just that the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is a coastwide state body, so focused on state waters out to 3 miles. Where the councils work with NOAA on federal waters out to 3 to 200. So we've talked a lot about the ASMFC doing something because that kind of makes sense given the
Yep.
migration. But yeah, they haven't taken it seriously. Again, what's key is, they need to hear from their constituents. So if we put a push to have more concerned citizens ask their governors to put in some safeguards for cownose rays, which we think would be really important, then you might, that's how you see the movement. But no one has been, or very few people have been asking for it. And Maryland, although it I like to call them the draft Maryland plan, seriously inadequate, but the best in the world because it's the only one. Um, the next step after them finalizing it and maybe strengthening it would be, we ask them to sort of champion it with other states. So they can do that through the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And, they could also figure out some federal measures through, I would probably be a toss up, no other councils, but Dean, unless you think it's wrong, I think the ASMSC would be the first step because of the state water aspect. Yeah,
Yep,
thank you.
I agree. Thanks, Sonia. Can always rely on Sonia to get my management right.
Let's see. Samuel asked, what is it about the Chesapeake Bay that makes it so ideal as a summer home for Cownose rays? And could that change?
Well, I think it's part of it is, and yes, it could change. I mean, if temperatures shift too much, it could end up getting too warm. They could shift north. But I mean, I think uh, what they're really attracted to is it's a highly productive estuary. And so there are lots of benthic and infaunal invertebrates for them to feed on. And like I mentioned, there are no large sharks in there, very few large sharks in Chesapeake Bay. So if you're going to move in there and you're a ray, you want to protect yourself, but you always also want to protect your pups. And they're a species that right after they pup, they mate again. So the males come up there too, so that they can mate. So it's a mating area. There's lots and lots of food for them, and they have some protection from predation.
Lucy asks, do they show up as bycatch in fisheries down your way?
The shrimp trawl, we have a pretty big shrimp trawl fishery, and so they do show up in the shrimp trawls some, but that's about it down this way. There are though plenty of charter captains that still take people out bow fishing for them, and so that's probably a bigger source of mortality. Shrimp trawls are a huge source of mortality for some of the small sharks and some of the smaller rays, but um, bow fishing is probably a bigger one.
Peter and Terry are kind of on the same line here. How long has the draft plan existed, and is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and BIMS involved in advocacy?
So the plan was started in 2015. I think I saw that the draft plan, its last edition was like 2019. So there's been a draft plan, ready for about 6 years. It needs to really be sent out and reviewed and finalized. And that's just for Maryland. Um, so I've been away from Virginia since 2007. This is bringing me back into my Cownose ray work, which I really haven't done too much of since 2010, 2011. And so I don't know about if Chesapeake Bay Foundation is involved in any of the advocacy. VIMS is certainly not. VIMS um, generally does not um, advocate. Um, and and they've been, a portion of VIMS has been on the other side of the coin and helping develop um, some of the markets for cownose rays. So there are VIMS people that have been heavily involved in the research. Bob Fisher's at VIMS, um, at least he was, and so a lot of the research that I presented today was done with me and collaborating with VIMS scientists, but they're not involved in the advocacy. Sonia says the last draft of the management plan was 2023. And so it's supposedly going to go out for public comment this summer.
So what about the original authors of the study that you rebutted? Are y'all speaking to each other?
Um, the it's funny you asked. So the lead author of that study, after I presented the rebuttal at that conference where he was one of the three keynote speakers, he cornered me in the restroom next to the urinal to talk about our rebuttal. Um, and he said to me, this is Pete Peterson, who unfortunately passed away just recently. He said to me, Dean, when you publish this rebuttal, don't lose sight of the story. And he said, and I said, what story, Pete? I don't see a story here. And he said, the story is these trophic cascades are happening involving sharks and rays. He says, and he said to me, I got all these people in the Bahamas that are telling me how the spotted eagle rays are responsible for the collapse of this queen conch population. And the top of my head almost blew off because I've been doing work in the Bahamas since 1989, and so I know very well what's caused the collapse of the queen conch populations. It's these, you know, two-story high piles of undersized conch shells from harvest, and so that's the last I talked to him about it. They did not try to rebut this paper, which we had a previous, they had another paper before this one on shark declines that we rebutted, and they published a rebuttal to our rebuttal, and we published a rebuttal to their rebuttal, and then they tried to publish the next level of rebuttal, and the editor told us to take it outside, no more. Um, but they never published a rebuttal to this paper, which I thought they would.
And Alan was interested to know, how did you get interested in fish ecology and Cownose ray specifically?
So I grew up on the Gulf Coast here, not far from where I live now. And so I was fishing with my dad out here in the Gulf of Mexico from a young age. And I caught a little shark, a sand shark, of course, when I was 7 years old. Turns out it was a newborn um, Atlantic sharpnose shark. I know because I still have it in a jar of ethanol or isopropyl, rubbing alcohol, because I saved it and preserved it. And and that made me, when I caught that little shark, I thought it was the coolest thing. And so I wanted to study sharks and rays from then on. And so I went on, I went through phases where I was going to be a pro football player and a rock star, but I eventually went back to marine biologists and sharks. And so Cownose rays specifically weren't on my list. I was in, when I came back to Virginia, I went to undergrad at Miami, then a Ph.D. at VIMS, and then I was a postdoc and faculty in Hawaii for 6 years, and then I came back to VIMS as faculty for a couple of years, and it's when I came back that this Cownose ray thing really popped up, and so that's when I really got involved because this whole idea of developing a market, and I knew this was a really vulnerable species, the idea of developing a market um, was taken off, and so that's how I got involved with that.
Well, we're certainly glad that you did catch that little shark and go on this journey. And we appreciate all of the work that you've been doing. And the scientific process is one of critical thought and review, and that's so very, very important. And this was a wonderful example of it. Sonia mentions that our voices are the key. If we want to get the safeguards in place with the plan, we should speak up. And now we have all these new fans of the Cownose rays. We're educated. Let's send some letters to Governor Moore and see if we can't push this forward just a little bit.
Thank you all for having me, and thanks Sonia and Lucy and all of my other friends, Jeff and Missy, for coming and listening.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for joining us for Must Learn Thursday. Next week, it's the Bearded Lady Project. Come and join us to learn what that's all about. Then we have crawfish coming up after that. So in the meantime, stay well, stay curious, and stay outside. And write those letters. Take care, everybody.
All right, thanks guys.
Thanks, Dean.
Bye. Bye.